I am Stephanie Grilly. I'm a member of the Yale Alumni Association Board of Governors and on the Careers, Life, and Yale Committee. And this is the committee that, in conjunction with the Careers, Life, and Yale initiative at the Yale Alumni Association, have these Thursday night programs, these offerings with alum. And of course, students can be a part of the audience. So it's a way for alumni to connect to alumni, alumni to connect to students. And this show tonight is part of what is known as, for better or worse, the Omnibus channel, in which we throw the spotlight on alumni that we think might be of interest to fellow alums, and allow for a very broad sense of who Yale alumni are. And we hope that the guests will share their pathway, from Yale to where they are today. And we'll set up a few kickoff questions. And, once again, please put your question or comment in chat and ask Tamar, Tamar Banner, class of '99, who, as you know, is a head brewer, has also been in craft brewing management. And she has a very interesting story in that she's been a part of the development of the craft beer business, going from garages and basements of beer enthusiasts to being, in fact, the beer which perhaps is today driving the beer industry. And along the way, the innovations and refinements that have come to brewing, and as well as fermentation. And of course, perhaps an interesting twist in that she is obviously a woman in an industry that has to date been dominated by men. And perhaps I don't mean just simply that there are a lot of men in the beer industry, but that to a certain degree, there's kind of a male culture. At least the image of a male culture with respect to beer. And in fact, given that word culture, Tamar actually was an anthropology major at Yale. So I'd like to kick off the questions by asking her, Tamar, how did you get from being an anthropology major at Yale to working as a head brewer in a craft beer business in Denmark?
Hi, Stephanie. It's a pretty long story, and one that I usually insist I'll only tell over a beer. So this is a pretty appropriate setting to be talking about it. But I didn't exactly know what I wanted to be when I grew up, when I was at Yale. Luckily, I figured that out about a year and a half later. But my first thought when I was leaving Yale as an anthropology graduate is that I wanted to adventure around the world. I wanted to experience different cultures. And fortuitously, I had a friend who wanted to open a beer bar in Jerusalem. He'd made some money in the stock market. This is 1999. So it was a time when many people were opening their own businesses. And so my senior year, second semester, I took one class in the business school to learn how to, run a business as a 21-year-old, 22-year-old. I didn't know too much about business, and I certainly wasn't going to know very much about it in Israel, but I did speak Hebrew. I learned about bars and brewing. I'd spent a summer in Colorado where I'd started home brewing, so I knew a lot about craft beer. And I was probably the best person he knew to go over and be his partner in this role. So I took this class in the business school, and everyone else in the class wanted to open a biotech firm. I was the only person who wanted to open a beer bar in Jerusalem. But I persisted in the class and learned very little that was going to help me the next year in Israel. And I got on a plane about 2 weeks after graduation with a one-way ticket, and really looked into this business. The idea was we were going to be first to market. We were going to open something that Israel had never seen before, kind of a bar with either brewing its own beer or one that pairs beer and food, what we now call a gastropub. And there's nothing like it because nobody there drank beer. So when I got there and realized that and did some, market research, I realized that not only were we ahead of our time, not only were we ahead for our time, we were ahead of our time. And luckily I made the decision to take a couple of years off. At the time I was starting to see a lot of friends and family having events back home, weddings and stuff that I wanted to go to. And I thought, well, if I'm going to spend some time to learn about the beer industry, it's much stronger in America. Why not come back to America and kind of get some education in the industry? And then I can open the beer bar in 5-10 years when the country's ready for me. And I got back, and the first job that I got was in brewing. I thought I was going to learn about sales and distribution and importing and all the things that were relevant for that particular business model. And for me, what was really interesting was making the beer. Being a bit of a home brewer and being a nerd about beer, and realizing that was actually something where I got to put my love of science together with the art and passion of craft beer. It really was one of these things where, first job I got in the brewing industry, I just never wanted to look back. So that was in early 2001. From that to Denmark is a whole another set of stories. I started at my first job in Boston at a brewery called Harpoon. And there I got to, it's actually kind of a funny story. So I called around to the different breweries in the area and was having trouble finding a job, didn't exactly know why. And I think it was because of the word Yale on my resume. Nobody was telling me this, but nobody was really giving me the time of day, even to sweep the floor. And finally, I got a hold of somebody at Harpoon because I knew they were hiring, and I called 3 or 4 times. And finally, I ended up talking to the head of brewing. And he said, so we're looking for people who will work long, hard hours on the bottling line. You're going to be pretty much standing in one place and doing something very monotonous, very manual. Is that okay with you? And I said, yeah, I really want to prove to you what I'm capable of. He said, okay, and we're looking for people who have a degree. I said, oh yeah, that's no problem. I have a degree from Yale. And he stopped. He said, oh, no. I meant who'd graduated high school. You're overqualified for this. I think we're done here. And I said, whoa, why is that a problem? And he said, well, I don't think we need someone to run the business. We need somebody to close boxes on a packaging line. And I said, that's fine. But, if I want to get my foot in the door as a brewer, I'm not sure how to do that. I'm a home brewer. I'm really motivated. And he said, well, why didn't you say all that at the start? Let's just do that. Let's start you as a brewer. I said, well, do you have an opening? He said, no, but I would be willing to take on the right person and train you how to be a brewer. And this is sort of very old school of him. A lot of people who got their start in brewing started as home brewers and then apprenticed their way into the industry. And that's actually what I did. I would work, Monday in the brew house, and Tuesday I would filter, and Wednesday I was in the lab, and really got to see the whole business as a bit of an apprentice, and worked my way up. And after about 5 years, he said to me, well, what do you really want to do here? Because I don't really have a management role to groom you into. I said, well, my dream is actually to go to Colorado, because I'd spent that summer in Colorado, working and homebrewing. There were a lot of breweries there that inspired me, and I wanted to go work for one of them. And so he said, well, I can only respect that. You said you'd stay 5 years, and here you've stayed longer than that. I will write you a glowing recommendation and wish you the best of luck. And I ended up getting a job at New Belgium, which was sort of the dream job for me. And it was weird for me to get this job at this brewery I respected so much, and then kind of not know if, after getting that job at 30, what was I going to do to continue to challenge myself? And so that's why I got into more management roles. I've gotten to work in some more programming related roles. I've a lot of things that you would be really surprised it takes to make beer, that probably a lot of people on this call have skills doing. I've gotten to do a little bit of in the beer industry. After 11 years at New Belgium, thinking that I would retire in Fort Collins because it's an amazing place to live, as you know, Stephanie. I decided that I needed another challenge, and there was a role opening at Brew Dog in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, to run the plant there. Brew Dog is a brewery in Scotland, and they opened an American brewery, and so I came on to manage production, and that was a really cool challenge. But my real hope there was for it to be a launch pad for me internationally. Brew Dog runs 4 breweries around the world, and they have all these brew pubs, and after about 2.5 years, I said, okay, so what do you see long-term for me? Where do you think I could go in the organization? Could I, if we open a brewery in Brazil, could I be the one to go to run that? And they said, you're doing a great job in America. We really need to keep you in America. And I said, all right, well, then you're going to lose me because I'm going to find another brewery, and found this great role here in Denmark. And Denmark is an amazing country, and it's been everything I've been hoping for. And I'm going to stop there because I've been talking a long time. Further questions, and then that way we can take the conversation whatever direction people want.
So can you possibly, there's a few questions to get started and that I'm going to get to really quickly. You didn't mention anything as to, I mean, it sounded like the first fellow at Harpoon was a fantastic guy, and it wasn't an issue that you happened to be a woman. Have you encountered or any bumps in the road? Have you encountered any difficulties? Has it made you take certain career moves because you want to prove yourself as a woman?
I think the fact that I haven't mentioned it in talking for 5 minutes straight is an indication that it never really was an obstacle for me. But I do consider myself lucky, and I consider myself a bit of an anomaly there. It's something we talk about a lot. I've been involved in the Pink Boot Society, which is an organization for women in the beer industry, for networking, for education, to try to empower women to feel comfortable joining the industry. And I have heard stories, I've shared stories. Of course, there have been some moments of what I would call old school thinking that I encountered in some of the early days, but never anything that scared me away, or if anything, it always made me feel like I could be stronger and that I could be a role model to other women. There's been a bit of a Me Too movement that's happened in the beer industry in the last year or so, and it's gotten a lot of us talking, and it's made me realize how important it is for me to not necessarily share how glowing my last 21 years has been as a woman in the industry, but use it to think critically about, okay, where were the things where I didn't even notice someone was being pretty obnoxious to me, and how could I have handled it differently, and how can I help support the women who are having negative experiences to understand that we're all here to support each other, and I'm an ear and an advocate. And lately, what I've been focusing on is how can we train breweries to have better education in hiring, more diverse hiring, and in training for sexual harassment and these kinds of things. It's amazing how many of these breweries are run by a guy who is just a home brewer, thought it would be cool, but never developed an HR department. And some of the breweries that have gotten really big have never put in some really important infrastructure, stuff that would have prevented a lot of the incidents that have come out in the last year or two.
So one more question going off in another tangent. Can you explain what a cicerone is?
Yeah.
Which is also on your resume?
Yep.
Because I think perhaps maybe a few people here who saw it in the blurb for the event might be interested in how they become a cicerone, or think maybe they already are a cicerone.
So cicerone is the beer equivalent of sommelier. It is a program that was developed probably about 15 years ago in Chicago, an association with the Brewers Association. And it was a way to give people in bars and breweries and restaurants an opportunity to formalize their beer tasting, beer knowledge, beer education. And it's really interesting to me how, as a brewer, when I went to look at the curriculum, look at the material, I was very impressed how accurate it was, because So often people think they know a lot about drinking beer and about what beer quality means, and they don't. So it was a very well put together program. And then I was surprised how difficult it was for someone who'd been working in beer for so many years to pass it. It's mostly because you have to learn about, beer styles, beer history, things that I don't actually do every day. And then there is a component, and beer service actually. So, how you pour a beer, how you clean a draft line, things that, I've always had someone nearby doing, but it was cool to get a chance to learn that. There's 4 levels to the program. I am a certified cicerone, which is the 2nd level. You can go all the way to Master Cicerone, which maybe one day I will study for. But again, the history and the styles would require a lot of studying. And right now, moving to a new country and studying Danish, I'm focusing on that.
So Stephen Calkins, do you want to ask Tamar your question?
I mean, I see that all the time that you spent out in Colorado with one of the great names in beer. And I'm one of these people who's been a huge fan of craft brewers and love the people who do it, and they buy local and they're nice people and they're all around wonderful. And I live in Michigan, and I've been so pleased that we are the home of Brs Brewing, and it was a real craft brewer and they stayed craft and all that sort of stuff. And now, they've been bought out by Japan's Kirin and the same people that own New Belgium. And I'm sort of just interested in emotionally, for those of us who care about craft brewing, to what extent, has New Belgium been changed, and to what extent is Bell's likely to be changed?
It's a great question. Kim Jordan, the founder of New Belgium, would have a monthly meeting with us every month for as long as I was there. And she called this 10 years before Anheuser-Busch started buying up breweries. There were some breweries that were bought up because they were started with the hope of being bought up. And there were others that were started without a succession plan. And when the founders were getting tired and didn't know what to do and didn't have maybe kids who wanted to take on the family business, they were getting bought up. And she said, we've got to do something that will keep this business as close to its core values and beliefs as it was when I started it. And when she looked at who was going to buy the business, I really believe that was a big part of it. I had left New Belgium when they were bought, but I was still an owner. So I think in 2016, we moved to 100% employee ownership at New Belgium. And that was a really, really big deal to all of us, because it meant not so much that every single one of us got to vote on everything, but that we had a share of the business. And she was giving all of these employees, at the time, I think we were 700 or 800 employees, she was helping them develop wealth. And it was this amazing business model that seemed like something that would be fantastic. Also in 2016, we built a second brewery, which was an enormous investment for a business of that size. And the business as a whole looked amazing in 2016 and had a huge turnaround in 2018. So it wasn't surprising to me and I might have the timeline a little bit off by a year or so, but when New Belgium made the decision to sell, I think it was the decision to keep the business intact, to keep the second brewery open so that all of those people wouldn't lose their jobs, and to give the business the cash to be able to continue to invest in the environment and in progressive technologies. And I don't think that, from talking to friends who are still at New Belgium, that it was impacted nearly in the way that breweries that were bought by Anheuser-Busch or Miller Coors were. And Bell's is actually, the way that the structure is built, Bell's is actually going to be managed by New Belgium, as I understand it, who is managed by a small brewery in Australia, who is managed by Kirin. And I think that in some ways will protect Bell's. Certainly, I know that with some of these breweries, at least for the first couple of years, there is a lot of protection of the original staff, and there's a lot of opportunities. Cash is put into education so that people are encouraged to stay. And if it looks like it's changing, there's a lot of other breweries that'll scoop those good employees up. So I don't know if that fully answers your question with a happy ending, Stephen, but I think there's room for optimism for sure.
And I remember being at the pub in the Denver airport talking to the manager there, and he was just so excited saying, we've got this employee tap where we can come in and we can bring our home brew recipe and it'll win a competition, and then that'll be made. And right there, I can, with that level of excitement and support, it was just really great to talk to him. Is that able to be survived, do you think?
That contest is amazing. The idea behind it is that anyone in the company has the ability to win the opportunity to make their own recipe. And the way that you win is the previous winner goes up to the bar with nobody looking, pours a pitcher of 3 mixed beers into the pitcher, anything that's on tap. Let's say there's 20 things on tap. And you, the contestant, have to figure out which 3 beers go into it and at what ratios. Which sounds like it's not that hard, but it's incredibly hard. And I participated for like 10 years and never won. I think, and the cost to make 1 beer is negligible and is such a great morale booster that I'm sure they'll keep it. I think New Belgium, I never realized what amazing things they were doing until after I left and missed those things. They have these little things like that mean the world to people. My favorite thing was probably that they used to have, there was a guy whose job it was to leave articles in the bathroom we called it bathroom reading. They weren't necessarily about your job. They were about the environment or an interesting article from the New Yorker. And it was cool because then it would spark conversations at lunchtime, with other people from other departments who'd also read the article in their bathroom, and it was just such a great thing to add to, company culture. That is a place that thought about company culture all the time. And I've now since taken some of the ideas and let's say exported them to Denmark to have some of the ways in which it brought people together to the businesses that I'm a part of now.
So the other Steve Bloom has 2 questions in the chat. Steve, do you want to ask one of them?
Sure. First of all, again, thank you for joining us, and what a great story. So one question is a pair of questions really is, you've had a path now from the time you were a student at Yale to here. It's not that you need to feel regret for anything, but are there, looking at it sort of intellectually, are there 2 or 3 decisions that you wish you had made differently between then and now? And then the flip side of that same coin is, what are 1 or 2 things or decisions or personal qualities beyond your obvious persistence and energy that you're most proud of?
Okay, if I, in getting to the first question, forget to the second question, just remind me afterwards, because they're both great. With the question about regrets, it's hard because I don't think that way, but coming from Yale and being a Jewish person with, parents who pushed me academically, and I'm guessing my mom paid you to ask this question. I, of course, always wanted, I was a bit envious of a lot of my classmates who went to get further degrees after Yale. And I finished my BS and, thought about graduate school, but there wasn't really time for it. And about 10 years ago, I started a program through a university in Scotland called Heriot Watt. They offer a distance master's degree in brewing and distilling science. And so I started the program. It's about 2 years worth of classwork, followed by about a year to write your thesis, and they give you 7 years to finish it. And you often do this program to get a job as a head brewer. And I already was getting those opportunities while I was taking the coursework. And so I didn't finish the master's thesis. Actually, I have right here all of the work I'm doing now. I actually decided to finally make it up, finish it.
I'm very impressed.
It took a lot. Like I said, I'm a little busy right now with the Danish classes, and with this, I wasn't going to get into it. But that was something that I regretted, and now I'm going back and finishing because it's important to me personally, even if it doesn't mean professionally very much anymore.
Yeah. Well, like you, I don't think in terms of regrets. It was more almost an intellectual question, which is, in a perfect world, what would you have done differently? But the second question was, what makes you kind of warm and fuzzy about what you've done between Yale and now? Got to be 2 or 3 things other than, as I said, you're energetic, you're persistent. That's obvious from your story. What else do you feel good about that you've done?
The thing that really sticks out for me has really very little to do with beer. there was a New Belgium, for whatever reason, used to give away beer at the tasting room, and so watched as other breweries were selling the beer in their tasting room. And over time, because they saw it as, you're our guest, come on in, have a taster, do a flight, learn our beers. They realized they were leaving money on the table and thought, okay, well, we want to start selling it. But because this was also something they knew the community took advantage of, people after a hard day of work or school would come out to, Fort Collins is a college town. They'd come out to the tasting room and they would pretend to be a guest and, have a little flight and get free beer. So to give back to the community, they said, okay, so at least for this first year, the sale of the beer is all going to be given to charity. We have no idea how much that'll be, but we'll figure it out. And at the end of the year, it was something like $100,000. And it was not an insignificant amount of money. And we as a group were told, all right, well, we got to figure out how to spend this. And it's, again, not an insignificant amount of money. It becomes difficult to decide how to give that money away. And so the employees were polled for ideas, and the ideas fell into about 5 categories. And so those of us who were interested took on researching the categories, and I was given the category homelessness. And so I researched the homeless population of Fort Collins and the problems that Colorado homeless face and what was being done and where the money could have the most impact. For the person who was researching arts, beautifying the city, there were like 10 concrete suggestions that employees gave. All of my suggestions were all give it to the homeless. So with nothing, nothing figured out. So I put together what I thought was a very compelling PowerPoint presentation after interviewing many of the key players in the city. And in the end, the employees voted to go in the direction that I was proposing and give it to the homeless through supporting, God, the word's escaping me right now, but basically helping to build a building in the community where permanent supportive housing, where people would be given a place to live. And from that, with services, that would be the cornerstone to getting them a job and keeping them in housing. And I'm really proud that we took a lot of people off of the street in Fort Collins as a result of influence that I was able to have. I'll never probably have, little secret, brewers don't make a ton of money. Ben, I'm sorry for giving that away. One of my fellow colleagues in the beer industry is on the call right now. But we, so I'll never personally have that kind of cash to donate, and to be able to be a part of making that donation meant the world.
That's a wonderful feeling to have the thing that you're passionate about work-wise go in that direction. That's a great story. The other question, Stephanie, I defer my question and my time to somebody else who has a question. But eventually, it would be wonderful to hear how is climate change affecting or going to affect your market position in the sort of greater industry. But save that if somebody else has a question.
And that's somebody, Genevieve Taft Vasquez, has a question about related to where the beer industry might be going. Genevieve, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, Tamar. I'm really enjoying this story. Thank you for presenting. I have a question that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but also serious. Given that I work for a large beverage company that's recently gone into the hard seltzer industry and seeing the popularity rise there, what do you think? What do you see as the impact on the beer industry?
It's definitely cannibalized a little bit of the craft beer industry, especially. Actually, the biggest impact it's having is on the aluminum availability. So due to a number of factors, there's a pretty significant worldwide aluminum shortage right now. One of those factors being a brand new industry, almost all in cans. So that's the hard seltzer industry. One being that I think people have learned that the beer in a can does not have the stigma it did 10, 15 years ago, because they have a liner in them now and they don't taste like metal like they did. I'm gonna say 10, 15 years, I'm sorry, I'm dating myself, 30, 35 years ago. And then the third big thing is COVID. So when people started drinking more at home and not going to bars as much, a lot more beer went into package than into kegs. And so there are, most craft brewers right now are being allotted cans for the year and told that their growth is going to basically be limited because of these factors. Of course, it's hard not to point fingers, and a lot of craft brewers are looking at hard seltzer, and so they're playing the "if you can't beat them, join them" game. A lot of craft brewers have started making craft seltzers, and they're differentiating by using, as craft brewers do, using whole ingredients, using real malts, and often ingredients that are made locally. They're doing the same thing by making seltzers with flavors with added fruit. So you see a lot of craft seltzers now that are maybe cloudy, maybe actually have a small amount of fruit in them, as opposed to an added flavor extract. Now, in my experience, both as a customer myself and having a lot of friends who are customers, that industry is being driven largely by the fact that it is low calorie. And so the ones that are whole fruit have more sugar and probably are not going to be as wildly successful as your White Claws. But I think like a lot of other movements we've seen, hard sodas, for example, I don't think this one is going to be, around as long as, say, craft beer.
Genevieve, what beverage company do you work for? If I can ask.
I work for the Coca-Cola company.
Ah,
Hence my little teasing her. And I went to college with Tamar.
okay. So Charles Joyner, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Tamar, thanks for sharing these experiences. I kind of have a little bit of an indirect experience in the local bar industry and live music industry here in Richmond, Virginia. And I'll tell you that I one of the biggest challenges we had is we needed a mixed beverage license to sell everything that we needed to sell. I never saw the craft beer craze coming. I never saw this happening. I wish I had, because I probably would have changed my whole business model to reflect that. But observing what I have here in Richmond, I'm sure in many, many other cities, I've seen this become actually the epicenter of social life. On Friday and Saturday and Thursday evenings, that's where people gather. No more dance clubs, really. There are restaurants, but it's restaurants or breweries. Where do you see it going from here tomorrow? There's so many of these places popping up. Do you think they'll sort of fall to competing with each other, consolidate? I'm assuming it can't just keep escalating like it is, but what's your opinion about where that craft beer industry is going, sales, the culture, the whole thing?
Yeah, if you'd asked me 5 or 10 years ago if I thought there'd be this many breweries today, I would absolutely have said no. I would have said there's no way, there's not room for it. But what I've seen happen is kind of what you were hinting at. A lot of the breweries that have opened on a business model where they are just as large as your corner bar. And that's as big as they intend to get. They don't intend to compete with, say, New Belgium. So I think there's room for lots of them, unfortunately, potentially at the expense of the corner bar. Mm-hmm. And then I think because they can offer now, a craft brewer in the United States can offer as much variety as a bar who can buy 15 different brands. They can offer that, but make them all themselves. The craft beer industry, what's been so amazing about what has happened, particularly in America, is that they threw away the idea that I live in this small town in Germany that makes this one style of beer, and therefore that's the beer that I will make if I'm going to become a brewer. I'm going to make beer from all around the world. I'm going to make it at least as well as they did, and then I'm going to innovate and take it in a new direction. In fact, even a lot of them have done sort of fusion with beer styles in a way that you've seen in food. And so that level of innovation has been fantastic and is now being copied around the world. What's been fun for me coming to Denmark is that I've gone back in time and I'm now watching the exact same thing happen, the exact same movement happen about 10 years delayed over here in Europe, continent wide. And I know that they're going in the same direction that the US is. Some of the interesting things that are happening over here that or haven't happened yet here, I can get into, but to continue on your question, I think some of them will go under, but not many. I think 8,000 breweries is a good number. COVID hurt a few, and that'll bounce back, I think. But we already do see a change in the culture in the industry. There is a small amount of competition that didn't exist before. One thing I've loved about the industry for the whole time I've been in it is how collaborative brewers are, how much information we share with each other. I've never heard of another industry doing this, where we'll get together at industry functions and talk about problems we're having and help each other solve them, talk about new styles we're coming out with. You don't really have this, secret beverage that I can't share. It's a trade secret I can't let get out. I think we're losing a little bit of that. And I could see that the more breweries you have out there, the more, there's a limited amount of shelf space in supermarkets and liquor stores. So that's where the competition happens. More so in breweries that package, less so in the breweries that have the tasting room model.
Right.
So Tamar, you're now in Denmark, and so you're in the old country, where the process of fermentation has been going on for quite a while. And you just alluded to some of the differences between what was, the States and Denmark, and the fact that in terms of the industry and sort of the development of craft beer, that the States are ahead. I don't want to say tension, but what is the balance between, say, this tradition of beer fermentation and then the latest and greatest in terms of technology, science, whatever? And is it a conversation that happens between them, or is there a certain train that's just moving forward and everybody has to get on?
Yeah, you've asked a lot of different questions in that question. I think a lot of people think that the difference between craft brewers and the larger brewers is the difference between art and science. And the breweries that I have chosen to work for have been larger craft breweries that see the value of science and weave it into their art. And I think honestly, if you want to make quality beer, you have to do that. You have to take it seriously. When my husband and I were first dating, he told me that he made mead at home, and he made mead better than any brewery or any meadery that commercially makes mead, in his opinion, could make it. I said, all right, put your money where your mouth is. Let's see you make me a batch. And unfortunately, he did not take into account the chlorinated water he was using, and his batch was full of chlorophenol, and it was terrible. And he admitted that he really didn't know all the things that went into it, and that no commercial meadery would make that mistake. It's been a joke in our relationship ever since, but I take this as a long detour away from the art versus science thing. I live in the shadows of Carlsberg here, much as I was in the shadows of Anheuser-Busch and Coors in Colorado. And in the early days of craft beer, they often helped the craft brewers out because they thought it was cute, and they thought they were doing these crazy things that would never take off. And then, of course, we saw they started to feel the competition, and as a result, their solution was to acquire a number of craft breweries. Here at Carlsberg, what has happened, from what I understand, one of my colleagues came from Carlsberg and has described to me how they've pretty much removed most of the human aspect out of brewing. Most of it's so highly automated that there is no need for anyone with a brewing education to be an operator. So it's run by operators now. And as a result, so much of the art is gone from there. And you see that when they try to make a new product. They will make a very safe, very flavorless version of whatever style they try, and it will come out like all the edges are shaved off, if that makes sense. And it's unfortunate, I think. But I think that is the what we call the macro beer. And what's happening in Europe is mostly that the craft breweries are starting, and that they are saying, look, we will respect traditions, and we will build off of them rather than throwing them away. And that's where all the cool innovation is happening. Some places more creative than others, as always has been. Belgium has always had a very creative approach to making beer, brewing with a lot of fruits and spices. And and innovative ingredients. And Germany is always much more traditional, and they still are, but still with with some room to play today.
So you said the magic word for Rob Greenlee's question, Anheuser-Busch. Rob.
Right. Hi, Tamar. I used to be an organization development consultant way back in the day, actually helping to start the Fort Collins Brewery for Anheuser-Busch. So I really applaud what you're doing, particularly from the brewmaster viewpoint. It was so much the mixture of art and science. And my question goes back to your husband-to-be's issue about the meat and the water, because I was so struck, and I was able to join a few times, and the brewmaster went through the daily rounds, drinking the water from starting with the water and then the brew in the first tub and then the second and the third, so all the way through to the final product. And I just wondered about your observations about the water in Fort Collins versus Ohio versus Denmark, where you are now, because I know it's different in every place.
It is, and so when we start with what kind of a beer are we going to make, the very first thing we typically do is think about where does that style come from and what is the water like in that place. So if you're going to make a beer that's a Dublin style, it's going to be very, very different than a Czech style, because the water in Pilsen in the Czech Republic is really soft and really mineral free, and the water in Dublin is very hard, and the styles that get developed as a result of the water make sense. The waters that are higher in sulfate are accentuated by hops, and hops accentuate that water profile. And so you see, for example, pale ales that came out of England or came from places with very high sulfate content in the water. Chloride, on the other hand, will give a softer, rounder mouthfeel. And so some of the more like the rounder, creamier stouts will come from a place with a high chloride ratio. So we will often say that the best thing to have is pretty neutral water, which Fort Collins does have, because it's a good starting point, because you can build off of that. And what we do today in most places that don't have the best water source for brewing, I mean, we have breweries in every spot in the country now, right? So it must be possible. The way you do that is with reverse osmosis. You strip your water completely down and then you build back up.
Wow.
What breweries in Fort Collins do is they run a charcoal filter to take the chlorine out that was put in by the city, and they're done.
Yes.
So reverse osmosis is much more expensive, and if you don't have to do it, of course you don't want to. And then of course there is the story to tell about where your water's from and what you've done to it. Consumers want to know, and so it's nice when you're able to say we're taking the water right out of the the river.
Wonderful. Yeah. So there is a reason why there are so many breweries in Fort Collins. This is great. Thank you.
Yep, that's where that came from. It's funny, the water in Fort Collins has two water sources. One is a reservoir and one is the river, the Poudre River. And they switch about halfway through the year. And they switch because the river goes through an algae bloom and you can taste it. The geosmin is the chemical compound that is noticeable when pond scum smell is geosmin, and when the lake starts to bloom, they switch over to the river. And typically the way that it's caught is that one of the breweries in town will call up the city and say, we're starting to pick it up in the water before we start brewing. We need you to switch over. So I think that's a pretty cool thing.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
Because you may have already answered this question, I'm going to slip Stephen Calkins' follow-up question in. He says he lived in Dublin for 4 years and Guinness made it very hard for craft breweries. Does Carlsberg do the same in Denmark? And I think you've answered that question, but do you have anything else to add?
I don't think that they make it hard. I don't think that they necessarily acknowledge that it's the same industry. I'm getting involved in the Danish Brewers Association here, and there's a big shift happening literally right now, which is within the last, say, 6 months to a year, where they're seeing the value of inviting all the craft brewers who may not come in with the same classical education as most of the Carlsberg brewmasters do. They're finally starting to reach out. They're finally starting to network with the craft brewers, and it's pretty funny to be back to where I was in 2001, where I'm the only woman in the room again. But I'm excited to see that start to flip over. But no, I don't think that they're doing anything, nothing that I've seen that is inhibiting brewery growth in any way.
So he hasn't had the question in chat, but Zachary Clues has his hand up, would like to ask a question.
Hi, Tamar. I'm a student here still. I'm not an alum yet, but I'm happy to be on the call. I'm a home brewer, and I've also been kind of following these trends in the brewing world in terms of popularization of different styles, and how there seem to kind of be like waves. And the IPA had its time, and now seems to, people are less enthusiastic about it. So I guess I'm wondering, from your insider perspective, like, what do you see as kind of like the next style that's going to kind of eclipse the IPA as the go-to, either over in Europe, in Denmark specifically, or in the United States?
I would say, so first in Europe, I think we're like I said, a bit behind. So right now we're going through the extreme beer craze, where everything has to be the biggest and the baddest. And that's 10 years ago in the US, 15 years ago. In the US, I would say the two bigger things that are coming out are this pastry thing. So you have a lot of beers that are pastry beers, whether they're stouts, or even you see some milkshake IPA, for example. And it's combining all of our love of sweets with, it's kind of turns your beer into a dessert, which I think is really cool. I could talk for 6 hours about beer and food pairing. It's probably one of my favorite parts of everything that I do. And it gives you a lot more tools in your toolbox when you have these kinds of flavors that didn't exist in beer before. And then the other big one is sour beer. So you see sour beers in two categories. There's the sour beers that are kettle sours, the very basic sours, for those who aren't familiar on the call, where you're basically just creating lactic acid. It's a very quick process, takes a day or two. It adds a day or two to your brewing process. And you create a very one-dimensional type of sour. And then the other souring process is either a mixed culture fermentation or an aging on a variety of lactic acid bacteria and some wild yeast. And the flavors that develop there are incredibly complex. They are, I would say, analogous to wine in the sense that they are, first of all, sour. Second of all, have a lot of malic acid and fruit acids that you would be familiar with wine. They pair really well with food, and these complex flavors take time to develop. So in much the same way as wine, you're honoring the process of time, and you're often releasing these in vintages. And I think that was something that nobody understood, 15 years ago. People started to understand it 5 or 10 years ago, and now I see it really starting to take off. The problem there is it's expensive, because you have to have it sit down for a long time. You need the right barrels to do this, and you need patience. And so, I think we're going to see this, the trend go like that here pretty soon, where it'll become more mainstream.
Thank you.
So Zachary's still a student. So can you recommend a different beer for Pepe's and for Sally's?
Oh God, I wouldn't dare. I prefer Pepe's myself. But no, beers that pair well with pizza. I love pale ales with pizza. I think the crisp hoppiness really does a good job of scrubbing all of the fatty flavors from the cheese, or the clams, or the mashed potato that I like to have on my pizza at bar. But yeah, no, not necessarily one for Sally's and one for Pepe's. What college are you in, Zach?
So I'm in the med school.
Oh.
Yeah. But I'm doing my PhD in microbiology. So it's the home brewing is the fun, application of some of the stuff I do in lab.
I see a strategic partnership brewing here.
Yeah, one of the things that I am often impressing upon people when I meet them from Yale alumni reunions, or when I was going to Colorado Yale Association meetings and stuff, is that there's actually legitimate science behind what I do. And I think people don't really know what goes into it, and it's fun to talk to them about the microbiology and the biochemistry and all the different applications for often what they do in my world.
So Elizabeth has her hand up. Elizabeth, do you want to ask your question?
Well, first, I'd like to say that I want to thank the speaker for an excellent presentation. I just think it's been outstanding. I personally have never liked beer. And I wonder, and I'm sure the beer industry is aware that there are people like me who don't like beer and will always take wine. And that's me. I mean, I'm one of them. And I've always liked red wine. I know there's some people who like white wine, that's fine. But personally, I always like red wine. But I just wonder, is there any effort on the part of the beer industry today to try to sort of get us to switch over, the people who like wine, red or white, whatever it is, to switch over to beer? I mean, it sounds like there's all kinds of innovations being developed. That's why I asked this question, but I think it's an excellent presentation one way or the other. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Elizabeth. It's funny because if it weren't, 2:45 here in the morning, I was leading there with Zach's question about the sour beer, because that is absolutely the crossover, I think. You could go to your local liquor store and you could ask. Often now there's a very knowledgeable person in the beer department who can lead you to some really good Flanders Reds or Flanders Browns. And these are these long soured beers that develop these flavors that I think as a wine drinker you might enjoy. Often my understanding is people who don't like beer don't like the bitterness, and the sourness is something that I think is taking beer in a different direction, and they're not bitter. We're also developing a lot of less bitter beers in many different directions, but often they're still hoppy. And my mom is also not a beer drinker, and so I use her as my barometer of, will a non-beer drinker like this? I'll often bring her stuff, and if it's a good day, she'll let me experiment on her. And anything with hops, she's not excited about. And hops are a pretty integral part to beer, and so unless we're going in a sour direction, I think we're keeping hops in beer for the foreseeable.
And in terms of another taste, Beth has a question for you about cider. Beth, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, thanks. Thank you. I'm in Portland, Oregon, so we have a little bit of beer around here. I'm a great cider, by the way. And we are probably on the head of the curve for the crazy beer stuff, but cider is also a presence here too. And I find that sort of a crossover sometimes for the people who are more wine drinkers. But is cider as much a presence around Europe as it is, for instance, in Portland?
Yeah, cider is another great crossover, and it's, a lot of breweries are getting into making cider. Although personally, I feel that cider makers do it better than brewers who try to take it on. But as I worked in developing New Belgium cider when we briefly made one, so I went out to Washington and Oregon to taste some of the ones that were out there. In Europe right now, there are cider regions, or I should say there are regions where cider is bigger than others. Denmark's not really one of them, but our brewery we did this really interesting thing. The company bought an old ketchup factory and put the brewery in there, and it's a much bigger place than we need. And so we have tenants who were trying to work together to build sort of a beverage mecca. It's about an hour outside of Copenhagen. So to get people to come out and want to tour the brewery, part of the way that we do that is that we have a cider maker on site, we have a distiller on site, we have a kombucha maker on site. And so we're trying to build a destination with all these different things. And of course, what's developing now is we're working on a beer with the guys from the cider. They will often give their pressed fruit, their pomace to us to use in a couple of different ways. And so there's often these kinds of crossover beverages that are developing that I think are super cool as a result. But going back to your question, I would say in Europe right now, cider tends to still be a bit more traditional in the sense that you have your Spanish style, your French style, your British style, and I don't know that there are as many people as there are in the US yet who are starting to get outside of that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much.
You just mentioned kombucha, and we have a med student here In terms of beer and fermentation, right now, the whole idea of the microbiome is making a lot of strides in terms of sort of a medical paradigm. Do you foresee in the future any possibility for craft beer sort of aligning or taking on, say, a more sort of health conscious slant?
Yeah, it's a hard one. I think that we dabble a lot, and in the U.S. in particular, it is hard for alcohol to put a health claim. The FDA, first of all, absolutely forbids it, but I think beer's a very healthy beverage in a lot of senses. It's got a ton of minerals and vitamins, high in calcium. It's actually got a fair amount of protein, particularly your hazier beers. It is, it's got a lot of polyphenols, which, are touted in other beverages. But at the end of the day, you're still drinking something with a lot of sugar and alcohol, and there's no getting around that. And so I don't see that necessarily happening with in any serious way. I think that you could feel a little better about your beer if you're drinking sort of a lower carb beer and not a milkshake IPA. But I still think it's a bit, healthier to drink a kombucha.
Okay. So as we are approaching the hour, I'm going to circle back to Steve so that he can ask his question, and also sort of tell us about cross campus, if you would, Steve.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I appreciate that. Most of you already know this who have attended previous sessions, but Yale does maintain an online community called Cross Campus. And so far, 20,000 members of the Yale community, roughly in a 2-to-1 ratio of alums and students, have joined. I'd encourage any of you haven't joined Cross Campus to do so. It's a great way to find people with common interests, even perhaps brewing. And the other question for you, Tamar, and it's kind of one of these heavy questions, so you don't have to give it a heavy answer, but climate change is upon us. How do you see that shifting things for your industry?
Yeah, so this is something that we've been thinking about, the good brewers have been thinking about for the last 20 years, for sure, if not longer, and are trying to get ahead of it. The biggest impact, of course, for us will be water. And living in Colorado, where there's often a drought, it's something that we were thinking about a lot at New Belgium. The availability of a quality water supply for drinking is something that will be a concern in the future, I think, for sure. And certainly then for brewing. I think a lot of breweries are trying very hard to get to have less of an impact on the environment, to take the approach of, the best thing I can do if I see that concern coming is to work on ways to reduce my footprint, whether that's breweries that are working on recycling their raw materials, working on energy savings, working on water savings, or donating profits to organizations that help to protect water and such. Also, a lot of breweries are donating to research in some innovative technologies that will either use fermentation to help to, for example, developing alternative fuel sources through fermentation or other, sort of cutting edge technologies like that. The breweries are trying to invest in that to help further the cause.
So it's to be appreciative of the time it is for tomorrow. Right now, it's now 3 a.m. in Denmark, but this has been absolutely fantastic. So, in fact, to show our thanks, Alice Young, do you want to share what you've said about what your daughter thinks of Tamar?
I have to read that.
Hi, all. She is a huge fan. She's one of the few also in the beer industry and has heard so much about Tamar. Has not met her personally. So thank you for all you do. She was actually in Denmark to present the beer in, I think it was October. And there's kind of a Me Too issue in the beer industry. And so she was asked to represent a number of women in the industry to talk about the issues. And so I've been keeping in touch with everything that's going on. So Tamar, I know how hard it is in that industry, and I'm just blown away by what you've done. And my daughter sends her very best regards. She looks forward to meeting you someday.
I would love it. I would love to meet her. It's a small industry, and one of the best things one of the most rewarding things of my career so far has been now turning it around and starting to mentor other women, making it easier for them to get into the industry than it was for me, making it a safe place and helping them find the resources they need. I love doing that, and I would love to meet your daughter if she's interested. I can get in touch with you through Stephanie.
Okay. Excellent.
Cool, that would be great. And they just opened their branch in Charlotte in what's called South End a couple of days ago. So please, if you're in the vicinity, in the hood, definitely go by and say hi.
Awesome. Well, congratulations to her.
Yeah, I think if you show up in any of the towns of tonight's attendees, they would love to come to their local craft brewery with you. This has been fantastic, Tamar. We really appreciate you taking the time. This has been most informative. And I want to invite everybody here to come next week. In fact, it's interesting, the topic next week is going to be coping with pandemic lockdowns, which perhaps many of us have been coping with. Yes. It's like part 2. So, and the guest next week will be, I hope I pronounced it right, Cecilia Fromita. Is that correct? But I hope you join us next week. And once again, thanks, Tamar, and thanks you all. Thank everybody here for making this, the audience, and your questions, a great conversation.
Thank